Hello, welcome to Hank's channel and to a conversation about geoengineering with two people who know lots about climate and climate change. We've got Adam from Climate Adam, which is the channel to follow. It's not easy to make a climate change specific channel and have it work, but you've really figured it out. And Miriam from Zenturo channel, and I'll have both of those linked so you don't have to figure out how to spell it. And Miriam and I have been friends for a long time, and I recently made a YouTube video about aerosols and their relationship to geoengineering. And Adam made a wonderful video that's maybe even a little bit too kind, but also is very instructive. It is a response to it. And I wanted to get on, and Miriam was also in that video. So I wanted to get on and talk through some of how I'm thinking about this right now so that I don't step in it if I can avoid it. And also because I think that this conversation, and this is one point that we all agree on, is going to become more and more relevant over the next couple of decades. And we're going to have it. So it's good to be a little bit ahead of the game. And if you're watching this, you're way ahead of the game. So know that.
I should say as well that Miriam agreed with you that I was too nice to you.
I could see the smile come up when I said that. I guess the thing I want to start out with is I may have intentionally underplayed the magnitude of the controversiality of geoengineering just to not be inside of that as much for people who were new to it. But let's talk a little bit about the magnitude of the controversiality of geoengineering.
I mean, I would say that when I've spoken to different climate scientists about geoengineering, I would expect a different answer about it from every climate scientist I speak to, but I would expect most of those answers to be on the negative side of the spectrum. I definitely don't want to say that's exclusively the case. I've definitely met people who are really think it's something we need to research and could unfortunately become a really important option. But in my experience, that's been a minority of the climate scientists I've spoke to about the topic. And I'm talking about all different kinds of geoengineering here, and we'll get into all that variation later, I'm sure.
I mean, I would say I've seen something pretty similar, especially if you talk to climate scientists, particularly atmospheric scientists and or oceanographers. They're always very negative because their research is all about how weird and connected and squirrely everything is. But then if you talk to some kind of more broader Earth scientists, you might get more of the positive leaning folks. And that's kind of a weird tension I've had, at least in the department that I'm in, and how some of the intro classes are being taught. There's currently quite a lot of fighting between people who want to talk about it and people are like, don't talk about it like that.
Yeah, don't. So I think this is an interesting piece of it, is that there's should we do it? No. We're there right now. I think pretty much everybody is on board with, as far as painting roofs white, that's fine. As far as stratospheric sulfur dioxide injection, that's no. But the question kind of that I've been surprised by is the folks who are we shouldn't be researching this because if we start researching it, we'll do it. And that doesn't jive with my understanding of what to do as people. I understand that research dollars are limited and you can't research everything, and so it is important to choose what you research, but it does seem like the human history is long. And so we should at least be learning if we can. That's a philosophical thing. It's not a specific to this conversation thing. And I was surprised to get that feedback where it was no, we should pretend that idea doesn't exist.
From my perspective, I see it more of a divide between the folks that want the observed experiments versus there's so much research on the modeling side. And my understanding is most people are actually, let's keep doing that because then we'll have a better understanding. But I know there is quite a lot of pushback from actually sending up the balloons and testing it. There's you're not talking about it, but the guy at Harvard who keeps submitting that as a NSA proposal every year, basically.
So why is there always some guy at every department in Harvard who's absolutely nuts?
It's not the same guy, is it? Just moving around the different buildings.
No, I don't think so. Yeah, it's a different. Every department has one though, so that he can get headlines that says Harvard scientist says aliens definitely real.
I would say on the caution around researching it side, something really important to mention about geoengineering, and specifically attempts to effectively block out the sun to make the world a bit cooler, to offset some global warming, is the effects could be really big, both the intended and unintended effects of it. But what might not necessarily be that big is the cost. And so there's this huge contrast between, this would be a huge deal if we did it, but someone could just come along and do it. And I mean, on much, much smaller scales, we've seen that kind of thing with geoengineering already, where someone's just kind of gone rogue. And so I have some sympathy for the people who are like, is researching this in some way maybe empowering people in that kind of position? Because even the people
to be like, if you only need $5 million to do it, there are guys with that for whom $5 million isn't a lot of money. You just take your boat out and you do it.
Yeah, exactly.
And see what happens.
And I mean, even the people who I've met who are the most pro this kind of geoengineering would absolutely agree that the worst way of doing it is in a kind of uncontrolled way that could also stop in an uncontrolled way.
Yeah. And weirdly, that's something that has happened. So there's this guy, I think he was a researcher in a Canadian university, I can't remember what, or maybe he's just Canadian. And he...
You sure he wasn't at a Harvard department?
I don't think it wasn't Harvard. And he took a boat out, and I think that like with the approval of the sort of people who managed this fishery, they dumped a bunch of iron filings into the ocean in order to feed the sort of base of the food chain, the algae, and there was an algae bloom. And whose water is this? That you could just do this is the question, because it's everybody's water, and it feels like you shouldn't just be able to do it. But he did just do it, and it became, I think he got in a fair amount of legal trouble about it.
I think you said that article, he broke 2 international laws.
Don't do that. That's one of the rules, is to not break the rules.
Yeah, but I guess this really demonstrates what could happen. Because what he did, naughty, but like not that big scale, but it really is a kind of taster for what a lot of people are really scared could happen, either in our waters or in our air. And to the extent who owns our waters, well, who owns our air?
Here's what I'll shift the conversation to now. I think that's it's important to sort of go through the bits that I feel like I didn't do great. So magnitude of controversiality, I feel like I kind of intentionally downplayed that. And one thing that I feel like I would definitely do different is to talk about the fact that studying aerosols is not new, and we understood and understand that when we take carbon producing like electricity generation off, or carbon producing energy generation of any kind off a line, then we will decrease the amount of aerosols in the air, and that will have an effect on the climate locally. And we know that we've experienced that. We've built that into models for decades. And I kind of like made it sound like this was a huge surprise, and it wasn't a huge surprise. The only person I have to blame for that is me not doing enough research. I feel like, though, that this conversation, and I've pitched this SciShow a few times, and we've always not done it, and I feel like that made me impatient. Because I feel like this conversation is like, it's like something that people don't want to bring up. They don't want to say it out loud, because then it's like, oh, so you're saying that coal-fired power plants are good for the climate. Because like it's too many steps. And I understand that like people only have so much space in their heads, and if you don't get them for the whole video, or if somebody takes a piece of your video and puts it in another piece of content, they're like, look, Hank says coal-fired power plants are good for global warming. But I feel like there's like an important story that aerosols are an important piece of and like they've been shielding us from some of the broader effects of global warming. And I don't know how to best talk about it. But I feel like it should be talked about.
The way that I thread that needle is like it is maximally good to reduce all that air pollution. Like climate change, while we can talk about it and like how many degrees warmer it gets, what we care about is how it's impacting people. And the impact of those aerosols from coal-fired power plants is so much worse on the people directly breathing it in than that increase in temperature from the masking effect going away and will be, and already has been, I guess, is the, if we want to get all too perfect about it.
I think the other thing I'd really mention is that this isn't like some hidden extra factor that climate scientists haven't taken into their calculations. I sometimes get people commenting being like, oh, but aerosols are cooling, so once we take away aerosols, when we get rid of fossil fuels, that would lead to some heating. Yes, it would, but this is absolutely taken into account when we think about, for example, how long we have to reduce our emissions by how much.
Yeah.
So, yes, it needs to be thought about and thought about carefully. And so climate scientists are thinking about it and thinking about it carefully.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that's been that warming is built into the model, the warming that comes from fewer aerosols in the air. At the same time, I think that like these natural experiments, which come in the form of both taking the sulfur out of the fuel for these cargo ships, but also in the form of volcanoes, like actual natural nature-based experiments. Taking the time to learn from those is important, and like the extent to which these aerosols have an impact is also local, and that's actually harder than dealing with global systems. So you can sort of say like on average the planet's going to get X number of degrees hotter, but you can't know where that's going to get distributed very easily, and so these chances we get to do natural experiments are very valuable.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know how in the weeds about climate models you want to get, but like the natural experiments are very important because that's where most of the spread across models comes from, is our understanding of what aerosols are going to do, how much cooling they're going to give. That's a major part of why like one model will be much cooler in the future versus hotter, is how it parameterizes the effect of aerosols.
And that is that because there may be more or fewer aerosols, or because we're not sure of the effect of the aerosols?
Not sure of the effect of the aerosols. So like we have the scenarios that we run that have different amounts of aerosols, and then each model will parameterize like how sensitive it is to the radiative forcing of different aerosols, like how much are they going to make clouds, how much of the actual aerosol is going to mask. And that's like a thing each model decides on its own based on the literature, but because those error bars are so big, that's one of the reasons why we get such a big spread.
So yeah, what we knew for sure was that aerosols had a net cooling effect, but it's absolutely one of our biggest error bars. And so anything which takes us away from computer models and into the real world, so we can say, oh no, this assumption was stupid, this is how it actually affects this kind of cloud. So useful for climate scientists. And you mentioned volcanoes as well. The other really big one that's happened recently was COVID, because a lot of industry got shut down for COVID. Carbon dioxide sticks around in the atmosphere for ages once it's there, but aerosols don't. So, in some local regions, there are changes in aerosols, and this has and continues to give climate scientists a lot of opportunity to try and unpick all this.
It's out here in the West, it's wild how much wildfire smoke can cool a day off. Like, it's not a cloudy day, but there's smoke in the air, and you're like, it was hot, and then the smoke rolled in, and now it's cool. It's creepy. It's like the sun is no longer getting to me. And then I think that the last big correct critique of my video is that I was sort of operating off of this preprint that was like, this could be responsible for 100% of the sea surface warming in the North Atlantic that we've seen. And the reality is there's a lot of stuff going on right now. There's El Nino, and there's this volcano that maybe increased the temperature or the amount of energy in the sort of global system quite a bit, because it churned a ton of water vapor into the air, which is a greenhouse gas, but is also much more temporary than carbon dioxide. That seems right. I got some people who are like, no, all of the warming is due to carbon dioxide. And I'm like, yes, no, yeah, like I get that the warming is due to carbon dioxide, but the lack of cooling is also due to decreased aerosols. There's a difficulty here when it comes to like the reality of how deep people are going to get into thinking about this. And so you don't want to add complexity when it's like, when the reality is that carbon dioxide and methane are like the whole story. They're the whole warming story. And especially, carbon dioxide is because it's going to be there for hundreds or thousands of years. It's just a very sticky gas, whereas methane breaks down into carbon dioxide. But that's actually good because methane is a more potent greenhouse gas. All this stuff, that it's very weedsy, and I really encourage people to get into the weeds on the most important issue facing humanity today. And it does feel better in the weeds because it feels like, there's complexity, and there are people working hard, and there's lots of people trying to come up with solutions. But most people aren't going to get into the weeds, and so the question becomes like, should you even talk about it with a general audience beyond just carbon dioxide is a blanket and it's smothering us?
I mean, I would say yes. I've based most of my career on the principle.
Yeah, I agree.
We should probably talk about this.
We're all on the same table.
Okay, good. End of call.
When we talk about it, you do want to talk about it in a way where it's like making sure people are engaged with the reality and the complexity and the difficulty of the problem.
And I think for me, maybe that was one of the things that made me a bit nervous about your video, is for people who aren't in the weeds and you hear this really cool sounding solution. Oh, we could just do what's been happening with these ships and maybe that could do it. It's very easy for someone to get the wrong end of the stick and be like, oh, solved, great. And in general, these kinds of silver bullet solutions, whether it's nuclear fusion or it's geoengineering or whatever, they appeal to a lot of people because you don't need to get into the weeds and understand the complexity of what we actually need to do to solve the situation.
And I'm sort of like a little bit battling between, the majority of my audience. Well, I think that I sort of imagine this Bayesian curve here where there's how worried people are about climate change. And in order to get the majority of people in the right spot, you're going to have a bunch of people that get pushed into too worried. And I feel like my audience, or a lot of what I see on TikTok specifically, has gotten pushed over into the doom. That's there's nothing to do about this, and this is all over. And that specifically happened with this spike in the North Atlantic sea surface temperature, where I just saw a lot of content that was like, oh, the runaway climate scenario has begun, and everybody start packing your bags. And it was literally content from doomsday preppers that was going viral with non-doomsday preppers. And I'm like, this is a vibe I do not like. But I think that the thing to do now is to talk about geoengineering. And one of the things that this conversation has helped me get my mind around is that just like with, switching from fossil fuels to not fossil fuels, there's a big wide range of things that are geoengineering. And the thing that sort of gets brought up first and is very scary, and I agree should not be done, is the most severe solutions, or probably the wrong word, the experiments that would affect the entire Earth, like putting a bunch of really long-lasting stuff into the stratosphere where it's going to last a long time, and we don't know where it's going to go, and we don't know what it's going to do. But there's a big, wide scale of sort of what geoengineering is. And so I guess the first thing is could you give me a definition, or should I try to venture to create one?
I mean, I have strong opinions on this. I know that Adam and I don't necessarily totally agree.
Okay.
But I like a super narrow definition because a lot of the things that are technically we could possibly change the thermometer of the Earth with these things have so many other co-benefits such that they become the primary benefit. Like painting your roof white, the benefit of that is primarily reduced energy cost, easier to cool.
Right.
The impact of that on global systems and even regional systems, pretty negligible. New York City has been painting our roofs white or silver for the last several decades. The temperature change impact of that, almost nothing. Energy costs, number of brownouts decreased. So I like a very narrow definition of geoengineering because when we talk about it from a policy space, it's really only the big scary stuff that we have to figure out. I think there's interesting science questions around what do we do with crop rotations and changing what we're growing, where we're growing. And then we can have a whole other conversation about planting trees. But I have a super narrow...
It's the only thing we need, Miriam. We just need to plant more trees and it'll all be solved.
Yeah. But I think it's really if the only purpose of the thing you are doing is to change the global heating, it changed what is the amount of reflective shortwave coming in. That's where I narrowly define geoengineering, because that's I mean, otherwise you got to include building buildings. Like that everything is, we're messing with the earth, Like,
Yeah. Reservoirs are geoengineering. Yeah.
So yeah, I think my definition is a lot more inclusive than Miriam's, which sounds good when you put it like that. I'm a very inclusive person, which is that it's any large-scale and deliberate modification of the climate. I don't think it necessarily has to be about temperature. I know some people talk about, for example, massive curtains near Antarctic ice sheets to try and stop the collapse of regions of Antarctica. I also try and be a bit more inclusive about it because there's lots of stuff which is like painting your roofs white, but isn't. Like, yeah, as Miriam alluded to, changing your crops or, for example, making the Arctic more reflective to protect sea ice. So there's lots of ground-based reflectivity kinds of geoengineering things, which are not on a global scale, but clearly would have bigger effects than just lowering energy costs. And so I just don't know where to draw the line, and so I just don't bother drawing the line anywhere.
And that like falls down onto a few different things. And I think there is a sliding scale, and it's not just like I think that it slides up to and until you get to the big scary of stratospheric sulfur dioxide injection. The thing about that is the reason people talk about it is it's super cheap and it would decrease the amount of heat in the system, and we know it would. Like it's kind of I like to think of it as like if it looks like everything's actually going to break and we're all going to die, then like at least we have like one last thing we could attempt, which at that point, we're not the only ones suffering. Like, all of the ecosystems are crashing and there's going to be mass extinctions. And so, like, maybe there is a last-ditch effort that has, like, not a super high probability of actually fixing the problem. But that's, like, a very science fiction scenario. Like, we're not anywhere near that. So, like, one step down from, like, the big bad, though, is something that, like, I don't know, it has an appeal in that we've been doing it accidentally and nobody freaked out, and so like could we do it better on purpose, of like low atmosphere, so like aerosol injection, which means the effects are temporary, and like if it turns out bad, you can turn it off in a way that you can't when you're doing that with the stratosphere, which is sort of like a more permanent solution. So I feel like there is at least a sliding scale even to solar radiation management, which is what like the broad term for trying to have less of the sun's energy hit the planet.
Sort of, although I think that because we don't totally, I mean, if getting into like a climate policy frame, because we don't necessarily know like the one-to-one relationship of like what was it doing to like precipitation, in the next region over, you could run into some pretty scary things where one country is blaming another country for a crop failure because the rain didn't come, especially when you're dealing with low clouds, like because those are predominantly like how we're
the clouds that make the rain.
Yeah, at least in the mid-latitudes. So where, a crop failure can be pretty devastating.
I would also say that the quickness with which it would stop, that could be a feature. It could also be a bug, right? Like if you're doing it and it's having quite intense cooling effects on the ocean, and then you would just suddenly stop for some reason, maybe because the person who did it was just going rogue and then someone stopped this rogue person,
right?
Then you're looking at like order of days before the effects you've put in place go away, before those salt particles drop out of the atmosphere. And like any amount of climate change happening in days, is quite a scary thought.
Couldn't you say that also about over the course of a year or so, phasing sulfur dioxide out of the fuels of the North Atlantic cargo ship fleet?
I mean, it depends on where it is. I mean, I am a land and atmosphere person, so like this is a little bit where I don't have a super amount of expertise, but my understanding of where the most shipping tracks are, and part of another reason why it's not necessarily believed to be a huge effect is because there is a window there for the sulfur dioxide, and it was already pretty saturated from the amount of like biota and those parts of the ocean, like they overlap.
So just like just like the life creating sulfur dioxide.
Yeah. So like when you take it away, how much of that? I mean, the ships. I'm not saying the ships weren't doing it, but like the impact of adding new bad
Yeah.
like cloud seeding in those tracks where it would be like most cost efficient. It'd
Probably
be
wouldn't
very
be
difficult
huge.
to tease apart what's doing
Yeah.
what in which window, and its effectiveness gets a little squirrely there too. And so like you'd be the place where it'd be like, oh, it's the cheapest to just put it on the ships that are already running. But then if we were thinking about it in terms of like a good experiment and effectiveness, we'd want to put it somewhere else where there isn't already all this life producing, where this overlap
Right.
doesn't exist. But that's more experimental design.
And I mean, the climate cares about gradients. The climate cares about the differences in temperatures between different places. And so if you're making some new chunk of the ocean a chunk cooler and not changing the temperatures elsewhere, that changes how weather patterns can form. I think it's also worth mentioning that doing it with salt particles themselves, that isn't just like completely innocent, because you can have salt raining out onto land, and don't know, lots of things, like important things that we like crops don't really like having
Right.
salt on them.
Yeah, and the first year might not be so bad, but the 50th probably would, because that doesn't like necessarily go away every year. It could build up. And so, Miriam, you bring up a very good point about countries blaming countries. So one of the things that has been frustrating about this a little bit to me is that, of course, we've been embarking on, if you can call it this, which you technically, with the definition, you can't, but we've been embarking on a many decades-long geoengineering project without any thought to what effect it would have or who it would impact. The reason it's not geoengineering is because it's unintentional. So you have to be intentionally doing it for it to be geoengineering. But aside from that, the entire action of climate change and dumping just, for like reasons that I understand, like people want stuff and quality of life increasing is good. We have been doing this for a long time. But like I have this like frustration that is again philosophical, that that it's very hard to try. It's like impossible to do it for like thoughtfully and intentionally, but it's very easy to do it accidentally and entirely without thought, which is what we've been doing. But you bring up a great point that like just because that's frustrating doesn't mean that it's not a problem. And like if you like, we're gonna live in a world and already are to some extent where like conflict is being created by climate change. But if you are also in a world where more conflict would be created by geoengineering, then that's something to take very seriously.
Yeah, I think you could also argue that a lot of the impact of climate change has been done pretty unilaterally, and so solving that with a unilateral decision by most likely the same quote unquote bad actors of history is not ideal.
Well, that's also frustrating. It's a bad vibe. Yeah.
And I mean, there being big disagreements about to do it could lead to what, there's not, the problem with a lot of this is we're just not sure what would happen, but we're sure that if we suddenly stopped doing it, that would be so, if we suddenly started doing it and then suddenly stopped, that would be so bad. That would just mean like all the climate change comes back in a matter of weeks, years,
Right.
months, depending on exactly what the kind was. And if there's not agreement about doing it in the first place, then you're in a situation where people might go ahead and do it, and then other people might go ahead and do whatever it takes to stop them, and you end up in the worst possible situation.
This was also in my video, and you rightly pushed back against this, is that I felt like a lot of the loud criticism I was the loudest criticism I was receiving was from people who were basically saying you can't talk about geoengineering, it will stop us from solving the climate crisis, which is not something I actually believe. I think that the solutions to the climate crisis have so many knock-on benefits, and it is so obvious that we need to do it. And also, we are getting like the cost of energy storage is dropping, the cost of solar panels are dropping, the cost of wind power is dropping. I think that the cost of geoengineering, or not geo, wow. I think that the cost of what the fuck is it called?
Geothermal?
Thermal, thank you. Energy.
Great, yeah.
I think it's gonna be a important part of the mix. Like, we're gonna move forward. We're not gonna be burning coal in 50 years. Like, we are already not building new coal-fired power plants in all like, you know, the wealthy world. Yeah, I mean, I guess we could go backwards. It seems, it seems tricky. I've ended up operating for a lot of my activist life in this space, basically pretending that the people who are pretending this problem doesn't exist don't exist. And that's a choice that I've made. I'm not going to get in a debate with a climate change denier, just like I'm not going to get in a debate with a flat earther. Like that, it's not an interesting conversation to be had there anymore, I don't think. But there are lots of reasons that are not that reason. So the loudest criticisms were from people who were like, you can't bring this up because it's going to give us an excuse to keep burning fossil fuels forever. I just don't think that that's on the table anymore. I think the big scary things with geoengineering, the real like concerns that do exist are, one, that this is a very complicated system and we only have one of them, so we can only do the experiment once. And two, that like it's a planet full of 7-8 billion people, and also those people have 200 something, you know, state governments and millions of local governments. And that's like a very hard problem space to do things intentionally that affect the whole planet. Like that actually, I think, is the hardest of the problems to solve, and it feels unsolvable to me in terms of like actually doing geoengineering in a way that like would feel equitable and fair, which I hadn't thought a lot about until I think, you know, your video and Miriam's thoughts about it.
I mean, I might be more optimistic about the solving the global like policy thing, just because that's the only like thing I grab onto for hope every now and then.
Well, what's the global policy that is offering you hope then?
Well, not a global policy, just like the prospect of we have gotten better. We are not good at it yet, but like including more people in these kinds of discussions. And like my rant at the end of that video is like, my biggest takeaway is I don't want the use of geoengineering to stop us from making the next Paris Agreement. And I really think that it would, frankly. And so I would much rather focus on
because it would create it would create like
it already breaks a bunch of international laws, as we mentioned earlier. And so like I would rather focus that, you know, how do we bring the world together on the actual mitigative efforts of, you know, reducing our emissions rather than combating future emissions. In terms of like what is a zero-sum game there. Mostly because one of them seems much easier because we have gotten closer and have made progress over time than the other one, effectively.
Yeah.
That's my for me, it's less of it's a thing that I don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about because it is such a hard problem to solve.
I would say that I think, at least within science, I don't think I've come across scientists who say, oh, we can just do this, and that would mean we wouldn't have to, you know, even the biggest proponents I met of geoengineering, they're not saying don't worry about carbon dioxide. Like the strongest statement I've heard is maybe when we've cut as hard as we can, reduced emissions as much as we can, this could be an extra little bonus on top. You know, I feel like that is much more common from the most positive people I've heard about geoengineering. That said, I think people who aren't climate scientists, who are normal people, it's easier perhaps to fall into that trap, especially if you're not in the weeds and you don't know all these these thorny issues around it. And that's something I'd like to mention is in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which is normally so dryly written. I mean, it's amazing, but it's so dry. They actually use the word thorny when talking about solar radiation management. That's how thorny it is.
The version of it's fine, we should just do this. I have seen people on Twitter talking that way, where it's like they want to convince you that they can't just spend $5 million dumping iron filings into the sea because if we just solved the problem that way, then they wouldn't get all this other stuff. What they actually want is to, you know, control industry, or I don't know, do some kind of global cabal of globalism to control people. So I have seen that. It is real. It's not imagined. So another thing that like could kind of be considered geoengineering is undoing the unintentional geoengineering we've already done by taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, slash in a number of different ways. So there's like an industrial way that you could do this. There's also the ocean seeding idea, which is questionable in whether it would even do anything, because of course, like, it relies on the algae like dying and sinking to the bottom of the ocean and not getting eaten and not entering the food web, but then like somehow being removed from the system, which they never are because they're in the ocean still. But and then there's like planting lots of trees. But then there's also like you've got the two major industrial ways where you capture it straight off of a smokestack from a cement plant or coal-fired power plant, and you capture it there, or you directly capture it from the air, which is even harder because there's, it's not a super concentrated mass of CO2. And all of these things, like, you can think about that in a way where it is geoengineering, but it's like, let's just try and get back to where we were before we started all of this. And that seems philosophically less like geoengineering. And also it doesn't have these like really local effects. It just has a global effect. And that's gonna have local effects, but not in the way that like cloud seeding will, where you're like taking water away from one area of the planet and putting it in another area of the planet. Is that geoengineering? And how important is it going to be?
I think also, would it work is an important third question.
Ooh, would it work? Oh gosh, it might not even work.
I mean, at scale and economically and all those fun conversations. Yeah. I mean, in terms of like the stuff we stick on a coal plant, we already have that does work-ish. Like that exists.
Yeah.
The big giant like fans in the sky, if that's ever going to work, like
direct capture from the atmosphere.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's very hard to imagine that working. There's also direct capture from the ocean, which is a new thing that is being done, and there's like a pilot plant somewhere on Earth. I almost said a country name, but like I'm only 80% sure that's the country.
90% sure it's on Earth, though.
Yeah, definitely Earth-based. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would consider it geoengineering. I think it's in the same bucket of like things people have a lot of controversial takes on.
Yeah.
And I think unlike with the geoengineering or like the solar radiation management argument, moral hazard argument of like, oh, if we do this, then it's an excuse to keep burning more fossil fuels. I think there is a direct, like the people that would make money off of direct carbon capture and CCS are the people that are making money off of burning fossil fuels. And that moral argument I find a lot stronger in terms of like the US just gave Occidental Petroleum a bunch of money for this, and I think that's bad.
This is it. I don't. This is like it. Like, is that like bad because it keeps Occidental Petroleum in business and burning more fossil fuels, or is it bad because like all these people who are bad are going to get paid to make the world better?
It's bad because they get to double dip. Like this should be, if we're going to do it, it should be a federally funded thing that these companies are taxed the heck out of to build.
Right.
Like it's absolute nonsense. These places can be like ruining communities, making tons of money off of A, ruining that local community, B, polluting the atmosphere, oftentimes lying about it for many, many decades, and then get a bunch of government subsidies on top of their subsidies for their emissions that they're already emitting. I think that's kind of messed up.
Yeah. No, I hear you. That is messed up.
I think a lot of climate scientists would argue that we might need a little carbon dioxide removal, that we might not be able to get all the way to the zero emissions we think we do without removing some carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But the word some in that is so important. It's like we want to turn the tap off as much as we can, and then we have to use one of these technologies, all of which are really hard, potentially really expensive, potentially use loads of land, and we like having land. It's useful for like plants and things. And so it's really just kind of the last little bit. And I guess one of the risks of just encouraging oil companies and saying, oh, you do this, is that can spin a narrative, oh, we can keep emitting as much as we want and then we can just suck the CO2 out the atmosphere as much as possible. I don't know of anyone working in climate science who thinks that would be a good idea. We want to cut as much as we want, not as much as we want to, as much as we physically can, and then use this a tiny bit.
Right. Well, and that, so Miriam, you were also talking about like the practicality of whether direct capture could ever work,
Yeah. I mean, that's like
which,
the big question mark. Like, I mean, we're looking for such a tiny molecule in such a small percentage of the atmosphere.
yeah.
There's like the costs on that are astronomical, and I know there's like lots of econ folks talking about like how they're going to make it scalable, and like a lot of people investing now, so it's cheaper later.
Yeah.
What's frustrating to me about that is like we could just keep bending the curve on all the stuff we know works and would be way more beneficial.
Right. Well, but the question there, like the reason being that CO2 is already there. So there's CO2 already in the atmosphere, and you can't get rid of it by not emitting more. And
True.
so like,
Well,
and that's like, yeah, but it is like wildly expensive. It's amazing to look at like the direct carbon capture, like decrease in CO2 versus anything else, which is so much cheaper. And you know, it's like per ton, it's just a huge amount of money. And it's like the problem is, I mean, I could someday be proved wrong, but like I'm usually on the side of technology. The problem is that it's like physics problem. Like there's only so much you can do to a carbon dioxide molecule, which is a very stable molecule. Like you have to spend a lot of energy to break it. And there's only so many carbon dioxide molecules per liter of air. You know, like you have to move a lot of air, and you have to get the carbon dioxide molecules to do something, which is possible. It just it uses a lot of energy. So you have to have giant solar power plants just to like do this. Mm-hmm. And you know, there's going to be a lot of like free energy in the future because of solar. Basically, you know, like during the peak hours, there's just going to be like excess energy. So you can kind of look at a world where maybe we're going to have a lot of extra kilowatts to spare, but even then there's better stuff to do with it, you know.
I think getting carbon dioxide out the atmosphere is difficult, but if you want to do it, doing it with direct air capture is making it so much more difficult than it needs to. It's just like the worst of the worst. Like
right. It's only like only in like the post-carbon utopia does it become a good idea, where you've like solved all the other problems, and then you've got like now we can get rid of the last bits that are still in the atmosphere by spending a tremendous amount of money to do that, because we're all so successful and happy in the future that we all hope that we someday arrive in. And also that like the truth of all carbon capture is that it is going to be done by the kinds of companies that are currently doing fossil fuels. Like it's a lot of the same expertises. It's like high pressures, lots of pipes, lots of pumps, lots of specialty pumps that do specialty pump stuff, lots of, you know, big tanks. And that's like, so like I'm like, I think that it would be good for there to be a thing that those companies do that's good for the climate, because just saying you all go out of business is a hard political pill.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's reasonable, but I think that they don't see it that way. They don't see it as an off-ramp to the next job. Yeah, and if they really, really believed, oh, we want an off-ramp, like here is a giant pot of money where you would have to change what you're doing. And I think because they're not.
They absolutely don't want an off-ramp. No, they want to be twice as big as they currently are. And and any policy that doesn't operate as an off-ramp, but operates as a getting you twice as big as you currently are, that's monster stuff for sure.
I have one other rant about CDR if you want it, or CCS if you want it, is that how much we actually need it. Which is, I don't know if this crossed your internet, but when the AR6, the sixth assessment report from the IPCC was coming out, there were so many headlines of like, the IPCC says we need carbon capture and storage. It is a requirement. And normally when the IPCC is conservative, it's actually like kind of a good thing, because when they say something that's a big deal, people are like, oh, it's actually a big deal. But the problem with this statement is that almost every single model and every single scenario used in the collecting of all of the IPCC report assumes carbon capture and storage in the scenarios. And also assumes, for some very confusing reason, that even in the best case scenario, we're still using 60% of our energy production from oil, gas, and coal in 2100.
But we're like, that means that we'll be building new oil, gas, and coal.
Yeah, I mean, it makes no sense. It's a pretty, I don't think a lot of people realize that, because I don't think a lot of people have gone down the weeds of like, what are the scenarios that all of these climate models are running?
Can I hit you with a take that's like an optimistic take that involves both climate change and geoengineering? Again, this is just storytelling. It's not based on research. I sometimes, in the sort of activist space, I think that people want people to be as scared as possible, like just very, very. And so like the story that I see a lot of young people hearing is very doomy. Again, it's that bell curve where I feel like to get everybody over here, some of the people get pushed into complete nihilism. I feel like if like climate scientists were in a true doom space where like this is not a problem we can solve and humanity is going to end, then they would be a lot more pro geoengineering. And so like the space between like this is a huge problem and we have to take it on, and if we don't, we're absolutely screwed, and we're absolutely screwed is actually pretty big. Because if the place where we were right now is we're absolutely screwed, then people would be like, we need to start thinking hard about stratospheric sulfur dioxide injection. But that's mostly not where we are. And I think also that what that indicates to me is that some of the more doomery ways of being an activist around climate change has a problem of then when someone comes along and says, well, why don't we do geoengineering? Then those young people will think, yeah, why don't we do that? Have I been lied to? Or is this a lie? Or like, what's the cognitive dissonance here where I'm not sure why, if we are in fact doomed, why we aren't exploring this option? Because it isn't that we're doomed. It's that if we don't take the problem on, we are doomed.
I think one of the biggest problems with how we talk about climate change is we talk about it as if it's this switch between like fine and flipping awful. I'm avoiding swearing. And it's not. It's, some people are already dying because of heat waves that have been made more likely and more severe because of climate change right now. And if we pass 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, some people will be fine. Perhaps they'll be making record-breaking profits. It's not a sharp line in the sand. What it is this gradient of things getting worse and worse and worse. And I think this problem of how we talk about it as if there's this sharp line in the sand, and then people can very easily convince themselves that we've passed that sharp line because there are lots of sharp lines, or what are actually blurry lines, but there are lots of lines that we've passed that we oughtn't to have. But yeah, as I say, those lines are blurred. It's a continuum of getting worse rather than this switch. But if you imagine it as a switch, then you're like, well, the switch is flicked. We need to do whatever we can to flick it back.
I think that is the real point here. I think you maybe give like climate scientists a little bit too much credit, because I know so many that just got bored of doing like imaginary physics problems and they're like, the Earth's more interesting. And so whether or not they would get like really into something because I thought it might be the right answer, I don't know if that's necessarily the case. So, I mean, that's one side of it. And I think like the other, the folks that get pushed way past the like bell curve of appropriately freaked out about this is I think like when people talk about, there's like an information gap, I don't think the information gap is like super populous. I think the information gap is for the people who got pushed too far because all they heard is this number's going up, this one number's going up, and it's also like CO2 and temperature focused, that you completely lose sight of all of the other impacts of precipitation and, plant life and animal life and all that other stuff. Or they get pushed way into the like biodiversity issue and they get lost in the, the forest for the trees kind of thing. And so that's the place where the information gap being filled is the most useful. But it's
right. So I because I'm kind of used to thinking of like people who are worried about climate change have a lot of good information about climate change, but that's not right.
I would say though, this idea of it as a spectrum that people kind of flow along and maybe start not really caring and end up over caring, from some of my experience, I don't think is necessarily the case. I think lots of people skip the middle Because if you believe in doom,
Yeah, for sure.
Just basing this on a lot of people in my comments, often what you do is you deny what mainstream climate scientists say. You listen to people without actually any expertise on the topic. And ultimately what you argue is that there's no point in doing anything. So you get to keep your life and the things around you exactly the same. There definitely are people who are super concerned about climate change and think it's too late and do that for really genuine reasons, exactly as you say. But I think there are also some people who actually take some delight in the idea that we're doomed because it means they can check out of the problem effectively.
So I think like understanding the sort of shape of the problem better and thus being able to be kind of a citizen in the space makes more sense, which is like why watch these people on YouTube and then you will be so far ahead of the average person, so far. Like amazingly far. Thank you so much for spending this time educating me and hopefully other people. The places to find your work, Miriam.
Zentoro, if you can spell it or click it. That's what I am everywhere on the internet. Yeah.
And I am Climate Adam in most places because I lack the imagination of Miriam to come up with a name which isn't just describing directly what I am.
All right, thank you guys so much. There's so much to know and so much to do. So thanks for doing the work.